Hello and welcome to another video review. This is The Last of Us for PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4, along with its DLC Left Behind. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PS4 version, which is The Last of Us Remastered. This is a third-person action-adventure game developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony in 2013 for PlayStation 3, and it was later remastered the following year for PlayStation 4. It was released, like all Naughty Dog games, to a ludicrous amount of acclaim, although it actually got quite a bit more than usual for Naughty Dog, and it has since gone on to become considered by many to be one of the greatest video games ever made. Now, of course, I will be examining that claim throughout the course of this review, but suffice to say, I actually didn't really want to play through this to begin with. Not because of the game itself, not because of the ludicrous amount of praise that it's gotten, but because of the sequel, which released earlier this year. As of the recording of this video, I have not actually played The Last of Us Part 2, but from everything I have seen about it, and the fact that it was actually spoiled for me when I was about 20 minutes into the original Last of Us, it made me ask the question, well, what happens if I actually end up liking the original Last of Us? Because at the time, I hadn't played enough of the game to really be certain. And given my prior history with Naughty Dog's games and finding that they're generally pretty underwhelming compared to the ridiculous amount of hype they get, I ultimately decided to go ahead and get The Last of Us over with and worry about The Last of Us Part 2 some other time. So, let's go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, and whether or not it's the masterpiece it's made out to be. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, where I do need to remind you that what you're seeing in the video and what I ultimately played for review was the remastered version, which is the PlayStation 4 version. It features noticeably improved visual fidelity compared to the original PlayStation 3 version, although it is worth noting that the PlayStation 3 version was released basically at the end of the PlayStation 3's life cycle, and its visuals were basically the apex of what that console was even capable of achieving. But ironically enough, the PlayStation 4 re-release is much more accessible to a much wider variety of people, and in fact it's probably the version that most people have actually played, so the collective memory of the graphics of The Last of Us is really more falling in line with the remastered version than the original PlayStation 3 release. And while I don't have any footage of the PlayStation 3 version to show you because I just don't have a copy of it, I do know what it looks like, and if you were to compare the two directly, you can think of it in the sense that the PlayStation 3 version looks like what would happen if you turned the graphics settings in Remastered down to a mixture of medium and low settings. Now, of course, for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 generation, it looked rather fantastic. It had some very good modeling and texture quality, as well as some good effects going on, but it was definitely held back by the capabilities of that generation, and when it came out on PlayStation 4, it was really allowed to shine. And if you look at the PlayStation 4 version even today, it still actually looks very good. There are a few things here and there that look a bit dated, most notably things like the face animations, but the rest of the visuals, from the modeling and texture quality to the shader effects, the water effects, all sorts of things like that, all still hold up extremely well even to this day, and you gotta keep in mind, this was one of the games that released in the very first year of the PlayStation 4. By the time Naughty Dog was developing this, they hadn't really learned all of the tricks and optimizations for the PlayStation 4, and as a result, this wasn't the peak of what they could achieve, and yet it still looks this good. If nothing else, Naughty Dog definitely deserves praise for that, and that's something that they consistently deserve praise for. And their attention to detail is something else that they deserve a huge amount of praise for, because they really went out of their way to make sure the post-apocalyptic aesthetics they were going for were absolutely perfect, and as a result, even though some of the visuals and effects are a bit dated at this point, the world still holds up, and it is still absolutely gorgeous at times. And of course, it also helps that because of the type of post-apocalyptic this is, you don't have to deal with the extremely muted and obnoxious color palettes that tended to plague the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 generation, so that also helps quite a bit. So they did a great job with the visuals, especially for the tail end of the PlayStation 3 generation moving on into the PlayStation 4, but what about the sound design? Well, the big standout feature back when this originally released, and the big standout feature really of all Naughty Dog games, was the voice acting, most notably the performances of Troy Baker as Joel and Ashley Johnson as Ellie. But while they certainly did an absolutely fantastic job, the rest of the cast also did an excellent job, and the direction was on point for everything. It's actually pretty difficult to find any sour lines in the entire thing, and the only times those really are noticeable is in the incidental dialogue that'll come up when you're listening to the enemies wandering around and searching for you and giving their idle chatter to each other. But when you take the voice acting as a whole, there are very few games that can even come close to the level of voice acting quality that this has. So everybody involved with that part of the sound design definitely deserves quite a bit of praise, but what about the rest of it? Well, the sound effects are generally very well done, with some very visceral and frankly kind of brutal sound effects going along with all the melee combat, as well as some fairly beefy gun and explosion sounds, although the explosions could definitely be quite a bit beefier. And I would have appreciated the gun sounds having a bit more bass kick to them as well, really knock you around a lot more, because guns actually are something that you don't use as often in this as you might think because of limited resources, which is something I'll get to more when I get to the gameplay. So they really need to be more impactful when you do use them, and unfortunately that's just not always the case. And then of course there's the soundtrack, which is very well done and works very well during the context of the game, but once you step outside the game and think back on the soundtrack, it's hard to remember anything other than a brief string motif that pretty much anybody who has played the game can instantly recognize as being from The Last of Us. And of course that's not necessarily a problem. I mean, like I said, the soundtrack works very well in the game, but it's not really the kind of soundtrack that sticks with you, and that is a bit disappointing. So when you bring all of the presentation together, apart from some slight blemishes here and there, they've generally done an absolutely fantastic job with it, and for the most part, it still holds up very well. But here's the thing, at this point we expect Naughty Dog presentation to be top tier. What really matter, however, are the story and the gameplay, and that's where things can very quickly fall apart if they're not handled carefully. Especially in a game like this, which is ultimately a zombie game whether you want to admit it or not. Sure, they do try to put their own spin on the idea of a zombie outbreak being the idea of the cordyceps fungus mutating and starting to infect humans, and they've done some pretty cool things with the design of the infected, having these fungal growths that gradually overtake their entire bodies and make them blind and have to find things by echolocation and all sorts of things like that. And while the focus of the game isn't actually on the fungus or the infected themselves, we are still dealing with a zombie game here, and at the time this released, there were a ton of zombie games on the market. And since then, the number of zombie games and zombie media in general has only gone up, and fatigue with the entire idea has only gone up, so they really did need to do something to set it apart, which is why they don't really focus on the zombies, they focus on characters. And to that end, you step into the role of Joel Miller, who starts out the game in the prologue section during the outbreak in Texas, trying to flee the chaos of the outbreak with his daughter, as well as his brother Tommy, and his daughter ends up being killed, which goes a long way towards making him a very bitter, miserable person. From there, a time skip of 20 years happens and the action picks up in Boston in a quarantine zone, which is one of the last bastions of humanity where basically everybody lives under an iron fist out of necessity, more or less. And by this point, Joel is a hardened survivor as well as a smuggler working with his partner Tess. And they start things out looking for a stolen weapons shipment that it turns out was sold on the black market to a militia group known as the Fireflies, who are ultimately going up against the quarantine zone authorities and are basically fighting a losing battle in that regard. When they find this out, they talk to a woman named Marlene, who is the leader of the Fireflies, and Marlene makes them an offer to double the amount of weapons that they would be getting if they, in return, smuggle a girl named Ellie out of the quarantine zone to a group of Fireflies that is hiding somewhere else in the city. They ultimately end up accepting this and take Ellie out of the quarantine zone, only to find out that she has actually been bitten by the infected, which means that ordinarily within 2 days, she would have turned into one of them. But it's been a couple of weeks since then, and she's still fine. And thus the reason for getting Ellie out of the quarantine zone into that group of Fireflies becomes clear. They're ultimately trying to find either a cure or at least a vaccine for the cordyceps infection. So they end up making their way to the rendezvous point, only to find out that all of the Fireflies that were there have been killed. And it's at this point where Joel feels like the entire quest is pointless, and it's at this point Tess reveals she's been bitten. She ultimately ends up tasking Joel with getting Ellie to the Fireflies by any means necessary, basically as her dying wish, because she ends up staying behind and tries to fend off the encroaching authorities flies for at least long enough for them to try to get away. It's at this point where the real focus of The Last of Us comes into play, because the game is not really about getting Ellie to the fireflies so they can find a cure. It's really about the dynamic between Joel and Ellie, and how over the time they spend together journeying across the country trying to find the fireflies, her influence on him starts to break down his hardened survivor mentality a bit and expose his more human side, and Joel's influence on Ellie starts to turn her more into a hardened survivor herself. And while that's not necessarily anything all that new as far as post-apocalyptic media in general is concerned, there's really not a lot of video games that even attempt to do something like that, so it really does stand out. And they've done an excellent job with all of the dialogue to make sure that the characters really do come across as believable people as opposed to just being very one-dimensional. And between the rather large amount of cutscenes that the game has, as well as the large amount of incidental dialogue that will occur as you're just walking around, or if you specifically go out of your way to look at things and actually talk to each other about things, you find that the game has quite a lot of character development, and it's handled in a very solid way, considering that the game takes place over a pretty long amount of time, and the characters develop gradually enough that it doesn't come across as forced like a lot of other games do. And while a lot of the story itself ends up being rather predictable, the characters themselves actually do a very good job of driving things along and keeping you interested. That sort of thing is exactly what Naughty Dog is best at, and it is on full display here. They have done an excellent job with most of the writing in this game, except for just the story itself being predictable in spots, and ultimately not being all that interesting on its own, but the characters more than make up for that. But here's the thing, despite about half of this game being composed of cutscenes and basically just walking around talking to people, this is still a video game, and that means gameplay is of critical importance. So what exactly is the gameplay of The Last of Us when it's not just cutscenes or walking around talking to people? Well, it's what we recognize these days as a pretty generic action-adventure game, in the sense that it is third-person, it has third-person shooter-style combat, it has a light stealth system, it has a light and quick craft system, there is some degree of scavenging resources, and there is a leveling system in some regard. Unlike a lot of these games, however, you are rather limited on the amount of resources that you have, meaning that more often than not, it's not necessarily a good idea to get into combat unless you absolutely have to. This means that an awful lot of the game is going to be spent sneaking around, which means that the stealth mechanics are extremely important. So what do you have here in terms of stealth? Well, obviously you can hide behind things, and you can crouch in order to move a lot more quietly, as well as make it a lot harder for enemies to see you. Sound plays a pretty big role in this, particularly when the so-called clickers are involved. Those are the cordyceps-infected zombies, basically, that have lost their sight due to all the fungal growths on their head, and ultimately find you through echolocation. And while they can't see you, their hearing is better than usual, so when you're sneaking around those, you have to move extra slowly to make sure that you are not making any noise, and make sure not to step on any fallen glass or anything like that, because when you do that, it makes a pretty loud noise that will immediately attract attention. You can distract enemies by throwing bottles or bricks to draw them away from you, or even draw them towards enemies in certain instances, and they can do some infighting, which is always amusing. But by and large, when you're sneaking around, it's just going to be crouched, moving very, very slowly, avoiding line of sight on enemies that have sight, and trying to be as quiet as possible when going up against enemies that can't see you. It is functional, but it does ultimately end up becoming rather tedious as the game progresses, and especially once you start going up against enemies that you can't really do much against. You see, there are several different types of infected. The most numerous one are the runners, which still have some degree of sight, but it's not a lot, and they still mainly go off of sound. And while all of the general stealth ideas still apply to them, you can also sneak up behind them and either shiv them for a quick kill, or you can choke them out for a much slower but still silent kill. The next type you'll encounter is the clicker, which I've already mentioned, and those are noticeably stronger than normal humans, so you can't sneak up behind them and choke them out like you can with the runners. You have to shiv them, which means that you need to be very careful when going up against them, because you can only have a limited number of shivs, and more importantly, you have to find the resources to craft those, and starting out, they break after a single use. But since the clicker clickers are stronger than humans, you can't really get into melee combat with them unless you have a melee weapon like a pipe or a baseball bat or an axe or something like that, because if they hit you once, then they kill you instantly, unless you have the ability that allows you to shiv them in order to get them away from you. So they're clearly high priority targets. But then there's the third type, the most dangerous type, which is the Bloater. These are infected that have been around for a long time and have hardened fungal plates covering their entire body, meaning they can take a huge amount of damage before going down. They're even stronger than the clickers, meaning that if you try to get into melee with one, you just die, because if they hit you once, you die. There's no shivving them to get them off of you, there's no sneaking up behind them to choke them out or shiv them, there's not even clobbering them with a melee weapon like you can with the clickers. It's just, if you get into melee with one, you're dead. So obviously you will want to keep your distance, but even if you do keep your distance, they can actually throw blobs of toxin at you, so you need to be careful about that. But as far as sneaking past them goes, the same principles that apply to the clickers apply to the bloaters. They can be distracted by throwing bottles or bricks, and if you move especially slowly while crouched, they actually can't hear you and won't notice you. Of course, you're not only going up against the infected, you're also going up against human enemies, most of whom are armed with guns. And funnily enough, they're actually a lot easier to deal with than the infected are, because there's no instant death BS with them. It's just a matter of sneaking up behind them, shivving them, or choking them out, or throwing things to distract them, or even just shooting them in the head for an instant kill. Because when you go up against the infected, you find out very quickly that, at least in the case of clickers and bloaters, a headshot isn't necessarily an instant kill. With human enemies, on the other hand, you'll know whether or not a headshot will be an instant kill, because if they're not wearing a helmet, then it will be, and if they are, then it won't be. Of course, the main difference between sneaking around these guys versus sneaking around the infected is that the human enemies can actually see you, so if you're in their line of sight, then they'll spot you regardless of whether you're making any noise. If you're in an enemy's line of sight, then you'll start to hear this roaring noise that gets louder the closer they are to straight up detecting you, and once they've detected you, then the alarm is sounded and everybody basically knows exactly where you are, at least for a brief time, until you manage to sneak away. Of course, as far as your sneaking goes, you have one major advantage that the enemy does not, which is listen mode. This allows you to focus your hearing and allow you to see outlines of where enemies are, at least within a certain radius of you, and that radius can be upgraded over time through use of the upgrade system. But while you're using listen mode, your field of vision is narrowed, and there's a lot of blurring on more distant things, so you can only see a fairly limited distance, and you also move extremely slowly, so you need to balance using that with also distracting enemies and moving a bit more quickly when you need to. And between the fairly limited options you have for actually sneaking around and the sluggishness of the listen mode and how it tends to be over-relied on, you find out very quickly that the stealth system itself, while certainly functional, is a bit bare bones, and more importantly, it gradually becomes very tedious over the actually quite lengthy campaign this has. But sometimes the stealth will be broken up by moments where you actually do need to go loud. So how is the combat system in this? Well, it's fairly typical of Naughty Dog in the sense that it has a melee combat system as well as third-person shooting mechanics. When you start the game out, you have two weapon slots, one for a pistol and one for a long arm of some kind, whether that be a rifle, shotgun, or something like a bow. And you can also craft and throw explosives or molotovs at things. Over time, you'll gradually find components that you can use at workbenches to upgrade your various weapons, as well as give yourself two additional weapon slots, one for a long arm and one for a sidearm respectively. And you can swap the different weapons in and out of these slots as you need to, whether that be because you ran out of ammo in the one you're using, or the situation calls for something a bit stealthier, or whatever the case may be. There's a pretty good selection of post-apocalyptic themed weapons on offer here, from things like basic 9mm pistols and revolvers, on up through shotguns and hunting rifles, and later on in the game you even get access to a flamethrower. As I mentioned before, going up against the human enemies, a headshot, unless the enemy is wearing a helmet, will be an instant kill, although in some cases you don't even necessarily need to do that, because for example, if an enemy is armored and you are trying to get around that, you might just whip out your shotgun and shoot them in the leg, thus blowing their entire leg off. There actually is quite a bit of dismemberment and gore in this game, environment, it is pretty brutal at times. And if it weren't for the rather limited amount of ammunition you have, as well as the fact that certain enemies, particularly bloaters, are especially bullet spongy, and the fact that this being a console game, your aiming controls are sluggish and imprecise, and more importantly, there's not really much in the way of aim assist, the gunplay could actually be quite satisfying, but the problem is that all of those issues exist, and it really does limit the amount of enjoyment you can really get out of the gunplay. The same can't really be said for the melee combat in this, because when you start out you don't have any melee weapons, you just have your fists, and you'll just go up to somebody and start hammering the square button to punch them repeatedly in a combo fashion, and occasionally the game might have you press triangle to dodge an incoming attack and then just go right back to wailing on them. But eventually you do gain access to melee weapons, and you find out very quickly that they could be satisfying but aren't because they break extremely quickly. Eventually you can craft weapon reinforcements that will allow you to instantly kill an enemy with a single attack, but after a while those enhancements will break themselves and then you'll just be stuck with the basic melee weapon itself. But those require crafting materials that you'd probably rather spend on other things. After all, like I mentioned, shivs are the only way to get clickers off of you, and they also have a bonus use of being able to open certain doors that you can't normally open, so you'll probably be spending most of your crafting materials that you could use on weapon enhancements making shivs instead. Regardless, the game doesn't have much in the way of finesse when it comes to its melee and unarmed combat. It is meant to be quick and brutal, and that is exactly what it is. It's just this primal beating each other senseless kind of thing, until you start playing as Ellie, in which case you can't really do that because she is small and weak compared to the enemies that you will be fighting. Unlike Joel, however, she doesn't use shivs. She has an actual knife that never breaks, so that is a benefit if you can sneak up behind enemies and knife them to death anyway. You can also stun enemies by throwing bricks or bottles at them and then run up to them and finish them off with a quick melee attack. In Ellie's case, she's going to stab them to death, and in Joel's case, he'll probably just beat them senseless. And if you happen to have a brick equipped and run up to an enemy and start doing melee, you can actually just start beating them with the brick as well. So it's not exactly a pleasant melee combat system, but it definitely fits in well with this it's them or me survivor mentality that the game generally has. The problem is that it's a very simple melee system. You only have the two buttons, square and triangle. You either are punching or just swinging your weapon around or whatever the case may be, or you're occasionally pressing the triangle button to dodge and then immediately follow it up with more square. And speaking of the square button, there's also a lot of instances where you'll end up getting grabbed by an enemy and then just have to hammer the square button in order to get them off of you, all the while taking damage. That's right, the game has its own implementation of quick time events as well, and they're very simple, very straightforward, and usually just kind of annoying. So the combat loop is pretty all over the place. On the one hand, it's rather visceral, and when everything's firing on all cylinders, it can be pretty satisfying, but it's very limited by the simplicity of the mechanics as well as the sluggishness and imprecision of the controls when it comes to the gunplay, and it's also limited by the fairly inconsistent AI. You see, sometimes the enemy can be relatively smart. They'll try to flush you out of cover, they'll try to flank you, and they'll employ some degree of proper tactics. Other times, they'll just kind of stand around like idiots and not really do much of anything. Sometimes when you're sneaking around, the enemy will spot you and you'll have absolutely no idea how because there's no conceivable way they could have seen or heard you from where you are, but they do anyway. And then other times it's like they're blind and deaf. And then sometimes the AI glitches out entirely and you just have no idea what in the hell it's doing. Thankfully, most of the time it does work as intended, but those occasional moments where it doesn't, and more importantly, the moments where the game just glitches out entirely for whatever reason, whether that be you going up behind an enemy and pressing the knife button and it starting to go through the animation of knifing them, only to suddenly find yourself in a chokehold having to mash the square button to get out of it. Or certain instances where the environment glitches out a bit, like one puzzle I was trying to solve where I was moving around a cart, and the cart ended up getting stuck and I had to actually load a save. It's moments like those that take you out of the experience and, more importantly, end up annoying you as a player. Now, weirdly enough, I actually noticed more technical technical issues when I got to the Left Behind DLC than what I experienced when I was playing through the main storyline, so I don't know what happened there, but the fact remains there are still some technical issues that are present in the game, and they do negatively affect the experience. But by far the biggest problem the game has is that tedium that I mentioned before. It's not just in the stealth segments, it's also in the very repetitive puzzle design, where a lot of it just involves finding a pallet to carry Ellie over water because she can't swim. And if it's not that, chances are it's going to be finding and moving a plank or a ladder so you can either climb over something or use it as a makeshift bridge. And those all eventually get to the point where you're just like, oh, here we go again, every single time one of them comes up. And you quickly start to realize that once you recognize the patterns, there's really not much in the way of thought going on with any of these so-called puzzles in this thing. They're all brain-dead simple, and the only real trick to them is just figuring out where the thing that you need to move around is. Aside from all of that, there is some exploration to be had where you can just wander around the areas to collect a bunch of crafting resources or components so you can upgrade your weapons or add holsters, or supplements which can be used to give yourself additional abilities like increasing the amount of health you have, increasing the radius of the listen mode, reducing the crafting time or making your health kit use faster, things like that. There's also the one that I would consider an absolute must, which is called Shiv Master, and that allows you to actually use the Shiv to defeat a clicker grapple. And while it is interesting that this does not use an experience point based leveling system like most other games of this type, it is still a fairly simple and rather limited upgrade system that doesn't really affect your gameplay all that much apart from the Shiv Master perk. And when you take a step back and you actually look at the gameplay as a whole, you find that it's not really all that much to write home about. I mean, sure, it does occasionally have its moments, but the game never really manages to get its mechanics anything above serviceable. Occasional glitches aside, everything does function, and it's certainly a very playable game, and for the most part you can put up with it, but it does gradually become very tedious, and the mechanics themselves are just not all that interesting. It is definitely a game that goes all in on its story and especially characters, and while that is definitely enough to carry it for quite a while, eventually the mechanics just start to wear on you and it really does drag the experience down. And the game's length really doesn't help in that regard. Sure, it's better for the character development, but in the case of the actual mechanics, it just gives it all that much more time for it to wear on you. And while I would say the mechanics are definitely serviceable enough that they don't manage to completely tank the experience, it's definitely nowhere near the masterpiece it is made out to be. It's a decent enough game that does two things in particular, which are the characters and the presentation really well, and then everything else is at best just okay. It works, it's playable, occasionally has its moments, but mostly just ends up becoming bland and repetitive. Now, of course, whether or not they improve things later on down the line with the sequel is another matter entirely, but as far as The Last of Us 1 goes, the only chance they really got to mess around with that was the Left Behind DLC, which I will briefly go over here. It doesn't really factor much into this review, but it is worth mentioning. It is a sort of prequel DLC where you actually play as Ellie this time around, and it has a bit of a dual timeline thing going on, where it takes place in the winter section of the main storyline, and then as you're going about that, it keeps having flashbacks to before she met Joel, back in fact before she got infected, and it gives you a glimpse into her life before the shit hit the fan, and a glimpse into her relationship with her best friend Riley, who has come back after having disappeared for quite a while, only to reveal that she is now a member of the Fireflies. Riley ends up taking Ellie over to the abandoned mall nearby, and they just start exploring things to their heart's content and continue to have these character building moments that Naughty Dog is so good at, and that mostly consists of just walking around and looking at things and occasionally watching some cutscenes. All of the main gameplay interactions take place from the present perspective as opposed to the flashbacks, although the flashbacks do occasionally have some gameplay-focused moments as well. Unfortunately, it does suffer from the same problem that the main game does, in that the writing is interesting and the character interactions are interesting, but the gameplay mechanics are just not all that interesting. And it certainly doesn't help that they don't really do anything new or interesting with the mechanics either. There's some slight tweaks on things, but nothing really all that substantial, and it just ends up being basically more of the same. Obviously, if you were really invested in the story and characters of The Last of Us, that's fine, but if you're like me and you had gotten to the point where the mechanics had just worn on you a bit too much and it just started to become annoying, then that actually ended up being more of a problem. And as I mentioned before, I also ran into more glitches during the Left Behind DLC than the main game, so I'm not sure what happened there, but that also didn't help. It is also worth noting that the DLC was a bit of a dick move for Naughty Dog and Sony because they released it for $10 for the PS3 version, and then not that long after they released The Last of Us Remastered on PS4, and the DLC was included for free with that. I mean, sure, you can get it standalone for $10 on PS4 as well, but there's not really any reason to. And speaking of not much reason to, there's not much reason to mess around with the multiplayer in this game either. A lot of people forget that the game has multiplayer at all, but it does actually have it. It's called the Factions multiplayer, and it consists of 4v4 modes where as you continue to win games, you gain resources for your given faction, and you can unlock things over time. The problem is that barely anybody plays the multiplayer, so you're going to have a very difficult time actually getting into any games that aren't basically just team deathmatch. And once you do finally get into a game, you find very quickly that the stealth and action blend that works alright in the single player doesn't work anywhere near as well in the multiplayer. It seems that the fairly weak multiplayer modes that Naughty Dog had been putting into their games up to that point also extends to The Last of Us, and as I understand it, they did not put multiplayer into the sequel, so maybe they've actually learned their lesson at this point. Regardless of what happened in the sequel though, maybe the multiplayer in this was an attempt at lengthening the actual time you could spend in the game, giving it some replay value, but it just doesn't work because multiplayer is always going to be about mechanics more than anything else, and the mechanics in The Last of Us just aren't all that great. Again, serviceable, they function, occasionally have their moments, but they're not really anything to write home about, and they end up becoming tedious after a while. And multiplayer based around that is frankly just doomed to fail. It does raise an important question, however, which is, how is the replay value in The Last of Us? Well, almost non-existent. Unless you just really like the story and characters enough to do a second playthrough, there's just not really all that much to keep you coming back to it. The only things you can really do are play it on a harder difficulty or just go for all the collectibles, and neither of those are really all that appealing. This ultimately makes The Last of Us, along with its Left Behind DLC, very much a one-and-done sort of deal. You play through the game once, you enjoy it or you don't enjoy it, and that's really it. But if it's got very poor replay value, that also brings up the question of whether or not it's worth playing in the first place. Well, I'd say that depends entirely on how much emphasis you put on gameplay mechanics. Because, again, the real strength of this game is in the story, and especially the characters and all of their interactions. If you're willing to push through some rather tedious and only serviceable at best mechanics, then you might want to give the game a shot if you haven't already. But if you tend to place mechanics much more highly, then you're probably not going to get a whole lot out of The Last of Us. Thankfully for people who place story and characters highly, they are enough to ultimately carry the experience and ultimately bring it up to a 3.5 out of 5, but I really can't give it anything more than that just because the mechanics drag it down so much. They're certainly not enough to ruin the entire experience, but they definitely overstay their welcome a bit, and it makes me concerned for the sequel, which, as I understand it, is about twice as long, if not more, than this. And to give you an idea, I was tired of the mechanics about halfway through this particular game, so if the sequel just drags things out even more, then it's gonna be a problem. But that's ultimately for another video, one that I probably won't be doing for a while because I'm waiting for the sequel to actually get cheap. So we'll see what happens whenever that rolls around. Thank you all very much for watching this one, and if you like the kind of content I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel in some regard, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.